There is a persistent assumption about the Korean War that tends to go unexamined, that its most enduring lessons are confined to geopolitics and Cold War strategy. Yet one of its quieter realities, rarely discussed outside engineering and logistics circles, is how profoundly it exposed the fragility of materials under extreme conditions. Equipment failed not simply because of enemy action, but because wood cracked, swelled, rotted, and collapsed under relentless cycles of freezing and thawing. In that sense, the Korean War did not just test armies, it tested the assumptions civilizations had long held about durability. History Vault, on-screen text watermark. This matters because, long before industrial materials, certain societies had already confronted and solved these same problems. Among them were the Vikings, whose survival depended on a deep, almost understated mastery of wood. Their ships, homes, and tools endured environments that were no less punishing than the Korean peninsula in winter. The difference was not luck, it was method. The Vikings understood that wood was not a static material, but a living one that needed to be guided rather than simply used. To modernize, timber is often treated as inert once cut, something to be shaped and assembled. The Vikings operated under a different understanding. Freshly felled wood was unpredictable. It held moisture, internal stresses, and biological processes that, if ignored, would lead to rapid degradation. What they developed was not a single technique, but a ritualized approach to stabilizing wood before it ever became part of a structure. This process began with timing. Trees were typically felled during colder months when sap levels were lower. This reduced internal moisture and limited the presence of organisms that accelerate decay. It was a deliberate choice, grounded in observation rather than theory. Cutting at the wrong time could mean the difference between a beam that lasted decades and one that failed within a few seasons. Once cut, the wood was not immediately used. It was seasoned, often for extended periods, in controlled environments that balanced airflow and protection. This was not passive drying. Wood was positioned, rotated, and sometimes partially buried to regulate how moisture left the fibers. The goal was not speed, but stability. Their use of oiling and tar was less about preservation in the modern sense and more about controlling the interaction between wood and environment. One of the most enduring images of Viking craftsmanship is the tar-blackened hull of a longship. This was not merely aesthetic. Pine tar, derived through a careful burning process, served as a barrier against water infiltration and microbial decay. But its application was not superficial. The wood was treated repeatedly, allowing the tar to penetrate deeply into the grain. This created a semi-flexible seal, one that could expand and contract with the wood rather than crack under stress. In effect, the Vikings were engineering a dynamic system, one that accounted for the natural movement of the material. This approach contrasts sharply with later practices that sought to rigidly seal wood, often leading to failure when environmental conditions changed. The Viking method accepted that wood would move. The task was to guide that movement, not prevent it. Shipbuilding became the testing ground where these techniques proved their value under the harshest conditions. Nowhere was this knowledge more critical than in shipbuilding. Viking longships operated in environments that combined saltwater exposure, temperature extremes, and mechanical stress from waves and travel. Failure was not theoretical, it meant loss of life. The construction method itself reflected an understanding of flexibility. Clinker-built hulls, where planks overlapped, allowed the ship to flex with the sea rather than resist it. This reduced stress on individual components, but such flexibility would have been impossible without properly treated wood. The ritual of preparation ensured that each plank behaved predictably. When combined, they formed a structure that could endure voyages across the North Atlantic. Archaeological finds have shown that some of these ships, even after centuries, retain structural integrity that speaks to the effectiveness of these methods. The same principles extended to settlements, where longevity depended on managing decay rather than eliminating it. Viking longhouses and other structures were not built with the expectation of permanence in the modern sense. Instead, they were designed with cycles of maintenance and renewal in mind. Wood that was properly treated resisted rapid decay, but it was still part of a living system. Foundations were often raised or designed to minimize direct contact with damp ground. Roofs were constructed to shed water efficiently. When components did degrade, they were replaced in a way that did not compromise the entire structure. This modular approach was only possible because the materials themselves behaved consistently. What emerges is a picture of a society that did not attempt to conquer nature, but to work within its constraints. Their rituals were not superstition. They were accumulated knowledge, refined through generations of trial and error. When industrial armies in the 20th century overlooked these principles, the consequences were immediate and costly. Returning to the lessons hinted at during the Korean War, it becomes clear that modern systems sometimes neglected the fundamentals the Vikings had mastered. Rapid production and deployment prioritized speed over material preparation. Wood used in fortifications, transport, and infrastructure often lacked proper seasoning or treatment. In the Korean climate, this oversight became evident. Timber warped, joints loosened, and structures failed under conditions that were entirely predictable. Engineers were forced to adapt in real time, rediscovering principles that had been understood centuries earlier. This is not to suggest that Viking methods could have been directly applied to modern warfare. The scale and context were entirely different, but the underlying lesson remains: materials behave according to their nature regardless of the era. Ignoring that reality leads to failure. What the Viking approach reveals about survival is less about technique and more about mindset. For survivalist-minded observers, the significance of these practices extends beyond historical curiosity. The Vikings did not have the luxury of redundancy. They could not rely on rapid resupply or industrial replacement. Their systems had to work consistently over long periods. This required a mindset that valued preparation over improvisation. Each step in the wood ritual, from felling to seasoning to treatment, was an investment in future reliability. Cutting corners was not simply inefficient, it was dangerous. This perspective challenges modern tendencies to prioritize immediate results. In environments where resources are limited and conditions are harsh, durability becomes a form of security. The Viking example demonstrates that achieving this durability is not a matter of advanced technology, but of disciplined process. There's also a broader implication about how knowledge is preserved and transmitted across generations. The effectiveness of these wood rituals depended on continuity. Techniques were passed down, refined, and embedded within cultural practices. They became part of daily life, rather than specialized knowledge confined to a few individuals. Over time, as societies industrialized, much of this tacit knowledge was lost or devalued. Standardization replaced observation. While this brought efficiency, it also introduced vulnerabilities when conditions fell outside expected norms. The rediscovery of traditional methods in modern contexts, whether in sustainable building, ship restoration, or survival training, suggests that this knowledge still holds value. It is not a rejection of modernity, but a recognition that certain principles remain constant. In the end, the durability of Viking timber is less remarkable than the consistency of the thinking behind it. What allowed their wood to endure for centuries was not a single secret ingredient or technique. It was a system built on careful observation, respect for material properties, and a willingness to invest time in preparation. These are not dramatic qualities, but they are effective ones. For those studying history, the lesson is clear. The most significant insights are often found not in the outcomes of battles, but but in the quieter details of how societies solve practical problems. These solutions, once understood, reveal patterns that transcend time and context. Remembering these practices matters because they remind us that resilience is rarely accidental. It is built step by step through decisions that prioritize long-term stability over short-term gain. If this kind of overlooked history speaks to you, consider subscribing to History Vault and sharing this video. There is much more beneath the surface of the past, waiting to be examined with the attention it deserves.